We live in a world where we get constantly bombarded with perspectives, teachings and points of view. What to believe, who to listen to. Here, I will provide some alternative perspectives. Here, you are encouraged to check for yourself, form your own informed opinions and make up your own mind. From the spiritual to the mundane, join me as I dive into some of the biggest and smallest issues facing us all. Hello and welcome to the podcast of Laird John. You know something, just about everything you think you know, without a doubt, without a shadow of a doubt. You've done your research, you've found out, you've dug deep, you've spent hours on end, nights on end, trawling through the internet. Maybe you concentrated on ensuring that you looked at only authoritative sources, shall we say. You know, you perhaps didn't look too much into alternative media. Almost everything you think you've found out that you're so right about, you will probably be at least partly wrong. So why do I say that? Well, it's just okay. Let me explain it another way. When you hold an opinion, is generally based on a combination of different things. One of those things is going to be everything you know or everything you think you know. Another thing, that includes everything you've learned, whether it was through education, study, research, or whatever. But there are always gaps in your knowledge, and those gaps in your knowledge are replaced with assumption. You assume that you can fill those gaps in because of your experience and wisdom gained from everything you've learned. So you make assumptions, and based on those assumptions, you come to a decision about what your opinion is. And to the extent that you have studied the subject, your opinion may or may not be more qualified than someone else's, but it's still an opinion, and it will still be partly right, but possibly also partly wrong. In almost every instance, it will be at least a little bit wrong. And this is when you're looking at all the mainstream sources. This is when you're looking at all the kind of sources and authoritative sources that theoretically we should all be looking at. And then there's another bunch of people out there, which sometimes includes me, who also looks at non-authoritative sources. So we look at alternative media and we look at alternative information. And we're also going to be at least partly wrong. However, our opinions will be perhaps influenced by a wider range of sources, just because we're not just concentrating on sources that are generally regarded as authoritative. So we have to look at what's generally regarded as authoritative. Sometimes that can change from one day to the next, and one of the main reasons that's been happening recently is because when someone who has previously been considered authoritative suddenly says something that goes against what's being considered the so-called mainstream narrative, then that someone is immediately ridiculed, classed as a conspiracy theorist, accused of being far right, etc., and all that kind of thing, and immediately dismissed and debunked. And then as soon as anyone ever cites that person as saying, well, look, this is an authority on this subject, and therefore, this is a valid perspective that I'm holding, immediately the person they're arguing with says, oh, but that person's been debunked. And so that, therefore, the authority to have an opinion based on experience and knowledge and learning is artificially removed from that person simply because they said something that goes against the mainstream narrative. So what's right and what's wrong? And how do you decipher what's right and what's wrong? I don't know now, do I? Because as I've said before in in other places, the waters are so muddied now, in terms of the information and the news that's out there, regardless of whether or not the sources are mainstream where the information is coming from, that it's almost impossible to tell what's right and what's wrong. It's been proven beyond any reasonable doubt that every source that we consider a a mainstream establishment, source that we've relied on for endless decades now in this country, in the UK, I'm sure in the US as well, and around the Western world in particular. All these sources that are considered reliable establishment sources, it's been proven beyond any reasonable doubt that they lie consistently when it suits them. And yet, because those sources have been held in such high esteem for so long by so many, it's taking a very long time for many people, if not most people, to actually come to an understanding that so much of what is released by those sources is actually at least partly false. So what happens is quite natural. That obviously people are going to stop trusting the mainstream media and those kind of sources and official government sources, and other official bodies, establishment bodies, the civil service here, whatever qualifies as the deep state in the US and other places. Those kind of sources, under whatever guise, stop being trusted. What do you do? Where do you go? Obviously, people are going to go to non-mainstream sources, and some people are going to, create their own non-mainstream sources, and so we have all these potential channels out there now, on podcasts like this one, and lots of different channels, other podcasts and places on YouTube and elsewhere, Rumble and what have you, that are positing different points of view and perspectives. But how qualified are they? How qualified am I to sit here and one of the things that I have been saying since the beginning, again in a variety of different places, it's just not up to me to tell you what to think, how to feel, or what to believe. It's just not my role. It's your role to go and find out for yourself. But how can you find out for yourself when it seems like the sources that you're supposed to trust the most are the ones who lie the most? So what do? You come to people like me, but how do you know that I'm right? You don't, do you? Because my research skills are probably, well, they are what they are, and I'm as good as I am, and I'll check things out as far as I possibly can, but I don't claim to be the be all and end all of truth, knowledge, and experience and wisdom. I'm just somebody sitting here in front of a microphone saying, go find out for yourself. Don't trust everything you see here, on mainstream or elsewhere. Don't trust me. Go find out for yourself. Go and discern. Make up your own mind. But how do you do that? The waters are so muddied. I wish I knew the answer. What we really need to do is get back to a place where we can actually begin to trust the main. I'm not going to say, I don't like that word mainstream anymore, to be honest with you, but we should have a main channel of information, such as what has been called a mainstream media up till now, and we should have an establishment that we can trust. And then we would be able to go to them and say, well, we think that this is now true because we know that we can trust these sources in the way that we used to think we could until a few years ago, for some many years ago. So what do you now do? How do we get to that place where we can retrust the establishment, if you like, retrust the mainstream media? How do you get them back to a place where they start telling the truth again? There was a time a couple of decades ago, and perhaps perhaps it started to break down a long time ago, bit by bit. But there was a time when, at least for the most part, you could kind of trust what the mainstream sources told you. So, for example, I mean, there is a kind of argument, I suppose, that now you can do it to a degree. So, for example, if you pick up the local rag that you have, whatever qualifies as a newspaper in your area, or as a local news channel, and they tell you about something that's happened locally in your area. There was an accident, someone was taken to hospital, the police arrested someone for doing something bad. Across the kind of normal, the spectrum of normal day-to-day news, you can kind of still rely on these outlets to tell you mostly the truth, or at least the truth from the perspective of the reporters at the time. So I'm not trying to suggest that these outlets are just constantly lying about everything all the time. What I'm suggesting is that there is something of a narrative behind anything political that they say. So you go to one channel and they may have a slightly right-wing slant, and you go to another channel and they may have a slightly left-wing slant. One of the things you should worry mostly about is if those channels who normally disagree with each other on everything are suddenly in agreement about the same thing. And one of the areas where that typically happens is when there is a cry for war somewhere around the world. And you look back across the decades, you'll find that the few times when the so-called right and the left in different channels across the Western world, whenever they've agreed on something, it's usually been to do with, who to go and fight and die for. What side to pick in a conflict is something that is very often agreed to between, it seems to be something that all the mainstream channels are in agreement with. And so they're all marching to the same tune, and then you find yourself marching to the same tune as well, without question. But actually, sometimes when all the mainstream outlets seem to be in agreement about something, that's the time when you should actually look closest at it and start looking what's behind it. But that doesn't mean, that I would necessarily have the truth for you, so you listen to what I say. It doesn't mean that any other non-mainstream channel on YouTube would have, the truth. They'll have their perspective, and that's all. My only suggestion to you is to go out and look for different perspectives. And this is really where I'm trying to come from, with all of this. A long time ago, I decided, and this was decades ago, I decided that the only way that I could arrive at any kind of reasonable perspective on anything, given that nobody is ever completely right about anything they think anyway, the only way I could do that is if I actually have enough of an open mind to look at what those who are fighting the most with each other all think on an individual level, actually giving them credit for some intelligence. In other words, the only way I can decide who is, when the right and the left are arguing about something, the only way I can decide for myself who I think is right is if I actually listen to both arguments with an open mind, as opposed to saying, okay, so I come from this particular political spectrum or that, so therefore I automatically have to listen to this perspective more and believe this perspective more and instantly dismiss everything else that's said. The only way I can arrive at a reasonable perspective of what's right and wrong is if I'm actually willing to sit there and listen to both arguments, or all arguments, equally, without prejudice, and actually give those arguments space. And then I might have a chance. And that's all I'm suggesting you do. I'm not suggesting, I'm not saying, believe me. I'm saying don't believe me. I'm not saying, just because I say don't trust the mainstream media, I'm not saying suddenly trust alternative media. Don't trust alternative media. They don't know any more than the guys at the BBC or CNN or whoever do. They know more. Actually, the guys at the BBC and CNN and other channels, where Fox News, GB News here in the UK, newspapers, The Guardian, the New York Times, Any of these sources, all right. All these sources have got lots and lots of professional reporters, journalists, etc., who go and do their job and do the best they can. Excuse me. And they're going to do the job the best they can, but they've all got their own particular slant politically. And they're also very much controlled mediums in the sense that there's lots of different influences behind them in terms of the perspectives and the narrative and the context that they report in, which is where you can't completely trust any of them. So if you really want to, if you want to believe something that CNN tells you, for example, then don't do it without, watching something that, you might think that Fox News is a TV version of a comic, but if you prefer CNN, but just watch Fox News for a laugh then, and listen to what they say, but actually, give space to what you're hearing, give enough space to what you're hearing to actually discern the argument that's coming out of the mouths of these people, and give them space, and don't assume they're being bad people just because you disagree with them politically. But likewise, if you happen to be a little bit more on the right, and rather than just dismissing everything that you hear on CNN and assuming they're just state propaganda and lying all the time, give enough space to them to actually hear what they're saying, and just give enough space to hear what they're saying. That's it, right? And don't immediately dismiss it on principle just because you think it's state-sponsored propaganda. If you're on the left, don't instantly dismiss the Fox News as a daily comic on TV or on YouTube and just discount everything they say, and don't assume they're all far right and all racist and things like that. Just don't do that, right? Because it's that very back and forth fighting constantly without making any attempt to listen to each other or talk to each other properly that's creating all the division and divide in the world in the Western world right now, that's causing all the problems. Everybody's too busy hating on each other to actually have, to actually discern for themselves what's right, because they're all stuck in their own echo chambers. So this is really where I'm coming from with this advice. I'm saying, don't trust the mainstream media, but don't trust any of them. It doesn't matter whether the mainstream, the channel happens to align with you politically or not. Don't trust any of them completely. Know that they will report some things reasonably accurately when they're normal day-to-day stuff, but also know that they have their own political slants and narratives and other powers behind them that control what they can say. Don't trust alternative media at all, but have enough of an open mind to listen to what they have to say as well, right? And don't ridicule people just for having a different point of view, and don't call people names because they have a different point of view, right? Because there's a line to be drawn here that if you call people names too much, there's two things you do. You run the risk, first of all, of becoming the monster that you're seeking to destroy, and you perpetuate the problem. You actually increase the prevalence of the issue by giving it energy. So it's just important to let go of that mutual hate that's going on around the world right now. People just need to start listening to each other again and stop talking at each other. I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. If you did, please share far and wide so others can benefit too, and download the podcast audio so you can listen again whenever you like, wherever you like. You can also view and comment on podcast episodes by visiting johnsoracle.com. Thanks for listening to the podcast of Laird John. I've been your host, John McVey.